This is a new Honda Civic Type R, which is widely regarded, not necessarily by me, but by most of my colleagues, as the finest large hot hatchback you can currently buy. With more than 300 horsepower through its front wheels, it is, to be fair, one of the most capable hot hatchbacks ever made. It's great. I've got a great driving environment. Come on to that a bit more in a moment. It's got loads of power. It's really fast, it's really grippy, it's really capable. It's got a steering system which is really nicely responsive, nicely weighty. It gives you a decent amount of feedback. The chassis is just absolutely mega. It's not the most delicate, it's not the most poised, it's not the most tippy-toed like an old Renault Megane Trophy or Clio or a Ford Fiesta ST. It's a real bruisingly, thumpingly capable, rewarding hot hatchback of that kind. And the engine is strong. These days it's turbocharged, it revs to 7,000, but it still sounds good and goes hard, and I like it very much. But how did we get here? How did we get to this point in Honda's development where it's making a bruising, thumpingly capable hot hatchback, and every time a Type R comes out, we expect it to be a thoroughly good car?
Well, Honda has a long tradition of sporting cars. Its founder, Soichiro Honda, was a proper engineer and a maverick, and he was not afraid to fail.
So he went into business around the time of the Second World War, making piston rings, and then after the war he had the idea, when he was making generators, that he might put some of his leftover engines onto bicycles and turn them into small motorbikes.
By the 1950s, his motorcycle company was so successful that he wanted to go racing. So he went to the Isle of Man TT to see how it could be done, and in 1959 he decamped there with a team where they fared averagely.
Some bikes finished around the top 10, but Honda was aware that his bikes did not have anywhere near enough power. So they went back to Japan and they tried again, and they developed the bikes, and they came back, and by 1961 in the 125cc class, Honda was winning and finishing second and third and fourth and fifth.
In 1962 the same happened, and by 1964 8 out of the top 10 motorcycles in the 125TT were Hondas. When it came to racing on four wheels, Honda was equally ambitious. He entered Formula One in 1964, and his cars finished 13th in one race and retired in the other two they entered. But by 1965, Honda finished 6th overall in the championship and won the last race of the season.
But Honda's real Formula One success came through its engines. Now, all right, if you've seen a McLaren in the last few years, you might be scratching your head and thinking, how the hell is that? But don't forget, this is a team that in the late 1980s powered 6 consecutive World Constructors titles and 5 World Drivers titles.
Throughout most of its recent history, Honda has been the most prolific manufacturer of engines on the planet. And nothing has defined its sporting engines quite like its variable valve timing system, VTEC.
That lies at the heart of the car that I want to tell you a lot more about today, which is the first Type R officially imported into Europe. One of the best driver's cars I've ever driven. A car that you could have picked up for buttons a couple of years ago, but I think now is widely regarded as one of the rarest gems of modern classics, the Integra Type R. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, turn on notifications, and you'll never miss another one. So this is that Integra Type R. It's one of the first official Type Rs to come to the UK. There was an NSX Type R in the early 90s, and then an Integra Type R for the Japanese domestic market, but eventually, towards the late 1990s, the Integra Type R arrived in the UK. We didn't get the standard Integra, we only got the Type R, which I understand it had a stiffer shell with more seam welding, and it was light too. Some lighter materials, and the bodywork meant that this is a 1,125 kilograms small coupe. It's pretty hard to find a B segment super mini of less than that these days. So the mechanical layout is thus: there's a transverse 1.8 litre engine with VTEC, come to in a moment. At the front, driving through the front wheels with a limited slip differential, and I've got a 5-speed manual gearbox in here. And of all the things that define Honda performance cars of that time, it was the VTEC and Here is why. Just like flicking a switch when you get to about 6,500 RPM. Here is what VTEC is and how it works. Now today, quite a lot of cars use a variable valve timing system, and the effects, especially when combined with a turbocharger, are pretty subtle. But back in the day, Honda's VTEC variable valve timing system was the absolute boss. And here comes, as Jennifer Aniston used to call it, the science bit. At low revs, you want valves that do not open very far, because that lets in a small amount of air and fuel, and it means that the engine is quite efficient. Now, as you up the revs and want more power, those valves aren't opening far enough to get lots of air in. But if you have a high lift cam letting in lots of air at high revs, that means drivability is massively compromised at low revs. VTEC, which is a purely mechanical system, gives you both. So the camshaft has two profiles on it, one low rise, one high rise. At low revs, the low lift cam hits the rocker and that opens the valves a short way, and that's all fine. The high rise cam is still going round at the same speed as the other one, but it's not touching anything because there is a secondary part of the rocker. This is the VTEC bit. And when you reach a certain rev point, the hydraulic pressure lifts enough that a pin is pushed across and the high lift cam starts hitting the rocker instead of the low lift part of the cam. At around 6,500 RPM, it is like a switch in this. It goes from one to the other. The sound is intense. The difference in acceleration is even more intense. And that is what helped make Honda's VTEC become a legend in its own lunchtime. I'm doing 60 miles an hour in fifth gear, which is top, and it's buzzing over at 3,500 RPM. So the nature of the engine, the nature of the fact that this car is light, means that it is a fairly buzzy, fairly noisy driving experience. And it's not helped by the fact that this is a fairly Spartan interior. Even air conditioning was an option back then. Mind you, air conditioning was an option in a lot of cars back then. But it is not the most cosseting of cabins. There are obviously quite a lot of differences between a car interior of today and one from 20 years ago. You may think that the plastics in this were designed for lightness. To an extent they were, but this is actually, moreover, just how car interiors were 2 decades ago. Today things are rather different, but there are consistencies between the Type R of 20 years ago and the Civic Type R today. So I think if you went from one to the other, you would say, yes, I am still in a car as focused as a Type R. First is these frankly brilliant, and quite often red, Recaro seats, which just hold you everywhere without being remotely uncomfortable. I've got a superb straight-on driving position. The steering wheel in this, as is the case with most cars, it's better than most new steering wheels because it's very simple and it's round. But it's a great driving position, and there is, of course, that unmistakable, oh my God, it's freezing, or oh my God, that's really hot, titanium gear lever.
Such is the focus of the Integra Type R's interior and the brilliance of its engine, particularly its lack of inertia and the aggression that its power comes in with. The Type R would be special even if the handling and steering were not very good.
But they are. I mean, they are really, absolutely, utterly fabulous. It's a car that is developed not just to have a great engine, but to have a brilliant chassis as well. So there is power assistance to the steering. This car is kind of at the limit where you could get away with not having power assistance. Not many cars these days of this weight. Maybe the Lotus Exige is the car that comes closest to this weight without power assistance. You kind of need it a bit, but it doesn't need to be over-assisted because it doesn't weigh very much. So I get quite a lot of road feel through this rack, which is about 3 turns between locks. So it's not slow, it's not fast, it's just in the about right Goldilocks zone.
The wheel and tyre combo is pretty small. The wheels are 15 inches and the 195 section tyres have a relatively generous 55 sidewall profile.
So even though the suspension is pretty well tied down, and I remember when this car came out, I remember driving one in the early 2000s and going, "Cool, crikey, this car rides a bit firmly, it's a bit stiff." But you know what, compared to today's hot hatchbacks, it's in a completely different sphere. You would go, yeah, actually pretty comfortable.
Because there's some compliance in the tyre and because the body weight is relatively light, there's a lot of free space in there for Honda to develop a chassis that A, keeps brilliant control of its body movements, while B, not knocking your teeth out from the ride department.
The ride is good, and those things all combine just to make this car really responsive to its steering, really agile, really alert. There is not so much power and torque. There's only like 130 foot-pounds of torque. Now, I mean, a base Civic will have that these days because it's got a turbocharger. So there isn't loads of torque steer. The limited slip diff doesn't get really carried away as, say, the Mark 1 Ford Focus RS did. It's just right. Everything is just in the right zone to be brilliant. And that's what makes it more delicate than today's hot hatchbacks. And yet it's more capable than earlier, maybe unpower assisted hot hatchbacks. It's just in this perfect zone. If somebody said, create the ideal specs for a front wheel drive driver's car, you'd go, well, inevitably it'll end up at a bit over 1100 kilos. A naturally aspirated engine that isn't too heavy, that makes 100 brake horsepower plus per litre, a great gearbox, a really lovely steering system, and compact dimensions and small A-pillars so you can see out brilliantly. As time goes on, I'm starting to think that there was just this absolute pinnacle of road-focused drivers' cars about 15, 20 years ago. Just before they became too bloated, before it had to cope with 300 foot-pounds through the front wheels, before it had to cope with NCAP crash regulations which push the nose further out and make it bigger and the whole car gets wider and heavier, and yet it has so much more usability and capableness than earlier hot hatches. I prefer it to all of the other front wheel drive cars I have driven. I think it's not just Honda at its best, but I think it's front wheel drive drivers' cars absolutely at their best. So some of the things that helped define the first Type R to reach Europe all those years ago still define the Civic Type R today, but there's no doubt in my mind that this is, and I don't say this lightly, I think the Integra Type R is the best front-wheel drive car ever made. Now this look at some of our heroes will become an occasional series here on Autocar, so if you would like to see any model in particular, please let us know in the comments below and we will make it happen. Meantime, don't forget to like, subscribe, up thumb, turn on notifications so you never miss a thing, and we'll see you back here very soon.